Nixon's administration, all I got to say about the Cold War is that it was during Nixon's administration that China and the Soviet Union were really dealt with as two separate powers. They cooperated in terms of Vietnam, but as I mentioned, 10 years earlier, in the late 50s, China and Soviet Union had broken away. And so what the United States began to do with Nixon is that we started dealing with China directly, unconnected with the Soviet Union. We call it opening China. We started having trade contacts with China. Prior to this, China was completely closed off. Nobody went in or went out. Soviet Union was completely closed off. But the United States, we had a visit in China, we opened up, we had some trade talks, and that basically created a triangulation where the Soviets and China, who already don't like each other, begin to mistrust each other more because they're not sure who's going to do a deal with the United States. So to this extent, Nixon is looked at as someone who's really doing a lot to help promote a kind of strong image for the United States. After Nixon, we get Carter. Well, we got Ford, but he's only in there for a little bit, and then Carter. Carter was seen as someone who actually was fairly weak on foreign policy. And he did this through a number of things. The United States built the Panama Canal. We had a 99-year lease on it. This was in the 1890s. When it comes up, getting ready to come to the end of the lease, Carter made the decision to give up the Panama Canal, and it would not be leased by the United States anymore. It wouldn't be controlled by the United States anymore. The Panama Canal is that little river that we made to separate North and South America, so that instead of going all the way around South America, you just go through that canal and you have quicker transportation. It's a vital strategic importance as well as a trade importance. For the United States to say, well, we don't want to do that, we want Panama to do this all by itself, and we're just going to move away, looks like the United States is just not going to be worried about these third world countries that might have other influence in it. And so after this, there was an immediate rise of communist activity in other countries throughout Latin America. At the same time, we had another kind of a difficulty. Soviet Union advanced into Afghanistan, and Jimmy Carter's response was to not do anything at all. This is an example where the Soviet Union goes in the Middle East, there's a line, they cross, and the U.S. has no response, which means that I can cross that line, maybe I can cross another line. The last thing was in Iran. There was a revolution in Iran. Iran did not used to be as totalitarian and radical as it is today. Prior to the revolution, Iran was just it was a third world country, was non-industrialized, but it was relatively friendly to the West. After the Iranian Revolution, during the process, they overthrew the leadership, and in the process, they captured the American embassy and took all the occupants hostage. This is, in all other situations, an act of war. And Jimmy Carter did nothing about the hostage. We called it a hostage crisis. They were kept as hostages for more than a year. And it was very embarrassing for Carter. It made the United States look weak, and as a result, then we see the Soviets kind of expanding throughout the world. This caused a great deal of reaction at home. Not only did the Republicans challenge Carter, but even many Democrats within his own party began to challenge Carter, saying, you need to stand up, you need to step up, we need to do something. In 1980, Reagan wins the election, President Ronald Reagan, and he wins on a wave of reactions on lots of different fronts. Reaction against Carter, appeasement basically means Carter's appearance of being weak. The fact it looks like he's not strong enough and it allows the Soviet Union to expand. It's a reaction against the economic recession. During Carter's years, the unemployment went really high, interest rates went really high, and inflation went really high, but wages went really down. It was a very bad recession. And so there was a reaction against the economy, a reaction against foreign policy, and then there was also just generally a reaction to all that radical stuff that people are still thinking about in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and Carter doesn't seem to have much of a position on that. So Reagan comes in with kind of as an antidote to all this. He came in with a very strong success, electoral success in 1980. When he's in office in 1984, he wins the election by an even greater success, bigger than what Nixon had had before. In fact, I actually remember the 84 election. Every single state except one went for Reagan. Every single state, 49 states went for Reagan. It was just as shockingly lopsided as you can. He really kind of turned around the image and the presence of the president. This is one of the reasons why conservatives all love Reagan. It's also obviously kind of one of the reasons why the liberals hate Reagan, because he was like the hero, and it was a huge shift in American political alignment. Most people in the 80s were Republican. Most people were Reaganites. And so that's why the liberals didn't like him. That's also, of course, why the conservatives do. And even today, we're looking at 30, 40 years, people on both sides of the party often will point to Reagan. So conservatives will say, I'm a Reagan conservative, and that's what I'm campaigning on. Liberals will sometimes say, I'm a Reagan Democrat, which means that I'm doing the things that Reagan would have done that was reaching over to the other side. And so both sides today look at him kind of in this positive light, even though the radicals and liberals still don't like him at all. Okay, now let's shift out of that. That's kind of a political thing, but we have to talk about how this has an impact on the Cold War. I mentioned Reagan being kind of a change. He is a change not only from the Carter, but he's also a change from Nixon. He's a change from Eisenhower. I made the mention that Eisenhower wasn't that different than FDR in terms of many of the policies. Well, Nixon had a different political foreign policy in the sense that he was able to end the Vietnam War using this triangulation against China, but on many other policies, he's not that different from even LBJ. He didn't end many of the Great Society programs. So Reagan really represents this kind of a change. Sometimes they refer to it as a Reagan Revolution. He has a change in domestic and foreign policies. I'm focusing mainly on the foreign policies. And in order to understand how he is responsible for ending this war, you have to understand what it is that he does different than the presidents that came before him. Now, before we do this, I'm going to give you some terminology. And there's lots of acronyms, lots of initials here. And so I'm going to tell you what these initials are because they'll help you. I'm just going to go at a time. ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. IRBM, Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile. SLBM, Submarine Launched Ballistic Missile, also short range. ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missiles. These are the missiles that shoot out other missiles. MIRVs, Multiple Independently Guided Re-entry Vehicles. These are a reaction to the ABMs. If you're going to shoot a missile to hit another missile, then the best solution is to put like 6 missiles in that missile. Only one of them is going to have a nuclear warhead. The other ones will be dummies, but they'll go all over. And if you're the guy who's being shot at, you don't know which one has the weapon, the warhead, and which one is the dummy. So you have to shoot every single one of them. The MIRV helps to make the ABM, at this point, somewhat obsolete. These are all acronyms. They're all types of weapons. The last thing that you need to know is this MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. I'll talk about that in a second. We already mentioned it a little bit. Now, just a short history on nuclear weapons. After World War II, the United States had to decide whether they're going to put their military defenses into missiles or into someplace else. you may have recalled, I didn't talk about it very much, but if you read your textbook or if you've seen any History Channel documentaries on this, the Germans had missiles. We're beginning to do missile technology during the war. It's called the V1 and the V2. The V1 was just like this, I don't want to say a bottle rocket, but very much like a bottle rocket. It was huge and it caused a lot of damage, but you had no guidance whatsoever. You just kind of aim it this way and it shoots and it lands somewhere. And so very useless in terms of an actual military. It scared people, but it didn't have any impact. A V2, towards the very end of this war, was beginning to be a little bit better at guidance, but there was no way of guaranteeing that it's going to actually hit what you're going to hit. So at this time in the 50s, a lot of these German scientists become American scientists, and we decided, are we going to go with the missile program? Are we going to go with using rockets for defense, or are we going to do something else? And in the end, we decided we won't do missiles. In the 1950s, instead of missiles, we put our energy on aircraft carriers, really big aircraft carriers. And the benefit of a big aircraft carrier is that you can put it anywhere around the world, and you can have bombers on the aircraft carrier, and they can just fly off, drop the bomb, and fly back. That way you don't have to worry about guidance. You don't have to worry about making sure you hit where you're going to hit. That aircraft bomber will make sure it hits. And so that's where we pursued for most of the 50s. Things changed in 1957 when the Soviets sent up, this is a satellite, it's about the size of a big basketball, Sputnik. They sent the Sputnik into the atmosphere and it became the first satellite. It's not a nuclear weapon, it's nothing, it's basically a radio beacon. It goes beep, 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 nothing else. But the fact is, if you can put a satellite into orbit, that means that it can go around the world over and over again. If you can put it into orbit, you might be able to program it to come down from orbit. And suddenly we look at missiles in a completely new light. Sputnik caused the rocket program in the United States to be reinvigorated. It's after Sputnik that we decide we're going to start not only doing rockets, but we are going to think about going to the moon. And the space program looks like we're going to do it because we want to see the moon and touch the moon, but the main motivation behind the space program is that if we can safely bring people from the Earth to the moon and land them back up, then we can also safely, more or less, send up a missile, have it go outside the Earth's orbit, and land anywhere on the world. And so the space technology, the space race, was kind of a secondary impact on practicing and developing our long-range missile defense system. So it's after Sputnik that we start building ICBMs. In the early 60s, there are no intercontinental ballistic missiles. There aren't really too many intermediate range missiles, but we developed those first. Submarine-launched missiles and intermediate ballistic missiles are kind of being developed at the same time. It takes most of the 60s, about mid-60s, before we're able to develop this. And by the time we get to the mid-60s, they do have missiles in the United States, in Iowa, in California, in Alaska, that can fly up and land and hit any point on Earth. But this is late. And as the United States is building this, of course, Soviet Union is building this. Now, that's just technology. One of the things that we have to look at in terms of the history is that there were some people that were very afraid of this missile technology. They weren't afraid as much because the Soviet Union is going to attack us. There were some people that were afraid that if we have this technology, the Soviet Union will be frightened into thinking that there's no way that they'll ever win, that this will be a first strike technology. In other words, we might be able to shoot this from far, far away, destroy the Soviet Union, and then we don't have any mutually assured destruction. And so there was kind of a policy, an attempt to try to make sure that we were all even. We deliberately looked for evenness. Now the Soviet Union was developing these missiles, but they were always lying about how many missiles they made. Remember, rule of might doesn't worry about honesty or being true to the law. They'll do whatever they need to do. So they might say, we're only developing a few hundred missiles, and they might have 10,000 in production. So the United States tried to come up with treaties, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was an attempt to limit the number missiles that both sides had so that they were both equal, which means that if they're both equal, then they would both have mutually assured destruction. That way, nobody would fight. And so we would have deterrence, continued deterrence. If we both know that both of us are pointing guns at each other, then we won't cross the line. And the weapons are these big guns. This is kind of a policy. And the thing is that it's not just a Republican policy. Republicans and Democrats supported this. This was an American policy to try to maintain equity. If the Soviets got too many weapons, then there was a risk that they would attack and then wipe all of our weapons out. And if they knew that, then there would be no cost. The cost of their war would be super low. Then they would win, and then they would come in. So we couldn't let them have this confidence that they could destroy all of our weapons before we even started. If they had that belief, then they might actually use it. So to prevent them from engaging in the war, we have to have equity, a balance. There has to be equality. But we don't need more than equality. If the Russians decide they have 10,000, all we need are about 1,500 with the multiple entry MIRV warheads, and that would have the equivalent of like 10,000 actual targets. And so that would be enough to guarantee that if the Soviets launched, we would launch and they would be destroyed. And if they know that they would be destroyed if they launched, they won't launch. It's the theory behind mutually assured destruction, nuclear deterrence. There's a downside of mutual assured destruction, and it's not the type of downside that you might think of. The typical Hollywood downside is that you've got two people pointing guns at each other, and if they just keep increasing the number of guns, and there's tons of guns on one side and there's tons of guns on the other side, that someone's going to get twitchy, they're going to get sweaty, they're going to get nervous, they're going to do whatever, some crazy person's going to shoot, and then boom, everybody dies. If you've ever watched the movie Dr. Strangelove, 1962, that's the whole point of the theory of the movie. It's a comedy, dark comedy, but some crazy person decides that he's going to shoot first, and this is going to create a world war. Many movies came out about this. Well, Reagan understands this, but Reagan also says that there's another dark side. It's not so much the fear that we have all these weapons, because the fact of the matter is both the Russians and the Americans are pretty safeguarded. They know about the nuclear deterrence, and so it's not enough, it's not going to be enough to have one crazy person to start the war. He's not really worried about that starting the war so much as he's worried about the fact that there's no end to it. If you've got two people pointing guns at each other, there's no way to end it. You can't end it if you make sure that one side has two guns and the other side has two guns. The only way to ever end it is if instead of one guy having only two and the other two, maybe one guy has 150 guns with 150 people on his side all pointing at the one guy with two guns. That would end it. And so Reagan gets rid of the idea of mutually assured destruction as a policy. He does not want equity. If you keep a balance, then you can keep that balance forever. The Cold War has already been 40 years. He doesn't want it another 40 years. I remember being in high school in the 1980s, and I remember my world history teacher asked me, this is like 1984, 1985, saying, do you think the Cold War will ever end? And I remember most of the people in the classroom, myself included, said, nope, it's just the way it is. It will always be this way. 60 years from now, we'll be in a Cold War. Because it's hard to envision how you could possibly end it. Well, Reagan had a policy change, the shift. It was a two-pronged strategy. One pronged strategy was to end mutually assured destruction. What that meant is that to end the balance. I'm going to go back here to the board, and I'll let you see what I'm writing here. Give me a second. The fact of the matter is that the U.S. and our allies versus the Soviets and their satellites were not equal. The US has a free market, and the Soviets have a communist market. And what that means, it's called a command economy. They don't allow free enterprise, they don't allow supply and demand, so they actually decide what's going to be made when it needs to be made. As a result, the economy was just significantly lower, not by 10%, not by 20%, but something closer to 85% lower, less. The American economy was just staggeringly large, mainly because it's a free market. The United States doesn't tell you what to invent. You invent because there's people that are willing to buy it. And so the economy was huge. What that meant in plain language in terms of military is that the United States spent roughly 4% of its gross national product on the military. 4%. I know we get this idea that we spend gobs and gobs of money, but even today, that number isn't that much different. We spend today more on Social Security, on certain social welfare programs, on education, than we spend on the military. But 4% of a huge economy is a huge number. And in fact, that number equals to about 50% of the Soviet GNP. 50% of its military, because they were doing an equal. They would spend as much money as we did. But because their economy is weaker, that same amount of money was half of their gross national product. Keeping in mind that they also are a police state. So these satellites are forced. It's not willing. Georgia isn't wanting to be under the Soviet Union. The Ukraine isn't wanting to be under the Soviet Union. They are forced. Eastern Germany doesn't want to be under the Soviet Union. So that means that the Soviet Union has to have military in all these locations with people with guns, and they have to be willing to use them. That's a huge expense. About 50% of their gross national product went to the military. So Reagan came up with this idea. If we double our military output, that'll put us only at 8%, which isn't that much. But if we double it, the Soviets are going to want to match it. And what happens if they double it? They can't. They can't spend 100% of their GNP. It's just too much. So this is the first prong. The United States immediately doubled the budget from $171 billion to $300 billion. From $171 billion to $300 billion. And the United States could do this, and it was still only 8%. For the Soviets to match, it was going to bankrupt them. At first, the Soviets tried it. So from around 1980, about 1980 to around 1985, the Soviets kept trying to kind of be at par, and it was getting more and more expensive. And so they weren't able to budget it. The thing is that wasn't the only way the United States was pushing this. If it was only military, there's always a risk that in acts of desperation, you might do something drastic. If you've got these two people and they've got two guns facing each other, and this other guy suddenly gets a friend, and another friend, and another friend, and another friend, and a whole bunch of friends, and they're all pointing at him, the guy might say, you know what, I'm going to die anyway, let's go ahead and fire. And so that's a risk. So Reagan had a two-prong attack. The first prong was we're going to end mutually assured destruction. In other words, we're going to end that balancing. We're just going to spend twice as much, and then it'll be unequal. But at the same time, instead of just attacking him or facing him with that, we're going to give him an out. We're going to constantly be saying, you don't have to do this. I'll put all my weapons away if you put all your weapons away. We can completely end this if you just agree to step down. If you just stop what you're doing, we will end all of our weapons. We'll get rid of large classes of weapons. So it was a two-pronged attack. The first one was to double the GMP, and the second prong was to come and have very strong negotiations. This INF treaty means we would get rid of all intermediate nuclear weapons. START treaty, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Not a limitation where we'll come up to this cap, but the exact opposite. We'll reduce everything down on both sides to very little. This is beginning to de-escalate. And Reagan knew that the Soviets could not support this. So after a while, they would have to come to the negotiating table. And in fact, they did. And Gorbachev is the guy who ends up being the Soviet leader sent to go out and be the one who's going to start negotiating. And it was called glasnost. It's called a thaw in the Cold War. And he came to the strategic, bargaining table, and as a result of this, we came up with a bunch of treaties that significantly reduced the number of weapons that we were creating. The problem is that the Soviet Union had already tried for too long with this. And so they were unable to dig themselves out of the hole that they created. And so they were flat going bankrupt. Not only internally, but they could not support all these satellites that are all over the world. And so the very first satellite, the most expensive one, the biggest one that they began to get rid of is in Eastern Europe, in the eastern, around by where Ukraine is, around by where Georgia is. They removed some of the guards that were preventing the Soviets from escaping. And so there was news coverage of just thousands of people going through these gates. Nobody's doing anything about it. And then within a month, they pulled the guards from the wall around Berlin Wall. The wall that had been surrounding West Berlin, that was in East Berlin, they removed the guards, which meant that there's nothing keeping the West Berlin in, and there's also nothing keeping the East Germans from going into the West. When that happened, and I remember it happened at the day, there was no announcement, there was nothing. In the morning, people realized that there's no guards there. And throughout the day, they couldn't believe it. They went up there, and people started going back and forth through the gate, and there was nobody there. And they proved there's nothing there. And by the end of that night, people were actually going back home, taking sledgehammers and tearing down the wall. And that's what this picture is, tearing down the wall. Reagan, prior to this, about 3 or 4 years, said, Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Well, by the time we get to the end of the Cold War, the people are actually tearing down the wall. This is 1989. The Soviet Union basically retreats as far back as it can because it cannot support the military all over in the satellites. Within 2 years, the internal bankruptcy is so high that Gorbachev is overthrown. A guy named Vladimir Putin. His brain's going to forgive me. I'll forget what it is. It'll come to me. Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin comes in and overthrows the communists, and Boris Yeltsin basically ends the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union is ended, then Ukraine becomes a new country, Georgia is a country, all of these satellites are now independent country. There's another year or so of different revolutions and whatnot, but for the most part, Soviet Union is gone, and when the Soviet Union is gone, the Cold War ends. Now, here's a question. And I think I mentioned this before. The Cold War ends. Whoopsie. You guys are looking at my part there, not at the... The Cold War ends. Lasts more than 40 years. If the Cold War was simply the U.S. and allies, France and England, against Soviet and the satellites, then clearly when the Soviet Union collapses and goes back to Russia and Ukraine and all these other little countries, independent countries, when that happens, then there's no Cold War. Except, the Cold War is not only between the U.S., England, France, and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was also always between between rule of law versus the rule of might. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Boris Yeltsin tried to create kind of a democratic government, but the Soviet Union had never actually had a democracy. It had a huge black market, it had a big kind of a mafia, criminal underground. It was very difficult for it to restore order. But it was in that direction. Putin is now following kind of in that same path. Is not a democracy, but it's in that direction. They're not communists, but they're not democracies. They're still more or less a dictatorship. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the obvious focus of the Cold War ended. But the conflict between rule of law and rule of might is still present. And so we had a very interesting thing in American history, and I'm not going to go into the details because I like to end at about 1990. 91 when the Soviet Union collapses, but throughout the 90s, about a decade, the United States figured the Cold War is over, so we focused on domestic policies. That's why Bill Clinton was elected in 92, because he didn't spend any attention on the foreign policy. We didn't talk about wars or anything like that. Nothing about the Cold War, that was over. We were talking about social welfare and what to do with how to do domestic policies. And for about 10 years, the United States didn't think about it at all. Until right towards the end of Clinton's presidency, there was an attempt to blow up the Trade Center. It failed. There was an attempt to blow up, in fact, a successful attempt to blow up part of an embassy in Africa. There was a couple of attacks. We began to see this kind of rising terrorism. And then, as you all know, 2 years later, 9/11, 2001, we have this massive attack, blow up the Trade Center, attack on the Pentagon, and then we realize that the rule of law may have won against the Soviet Union, but it doesn't mean that the rule by might has disappeared. And so since 2001, 9/11, the United States continues to be in a Cold War. The difference is that the target isn't the Soviet Union and its allies, its satellites. It's against terrorism and those that are explicitly trying to undermine the rule of law through the threat of fear and basically terrorist acts. And that's where our Cold War has shifted into. And you could say that that's what's been going on the last 18 years at the very least. That's the end of our story. I don't like to go into details the last 20 years because the last 20 years would be my memory. Your memory is just as good. You can look up newspapers for that. We don't have access to presidential papers. We don't have access to a lot of the things that we need to really understand this. And so I'm not going to give you just my opinion on these things. I like to stop the war history right at the point where historians can honestly stop. So into the Cold War in 1991. But you have a little bit of an overview where the 90s is focused primarily on domestic issues. After 9/11, we focused primarily on foreign policy issues. I would argue that probably Obama, what makes Obama will be remembered, is that he was an attempt to go back to domestic policies and kind of forego the foreign policy side. And so we'll see how this ends up. We don't know what the end of the war on terror is because we're in the middle of it. Give us 60 years, we'll be able to look back at this, we'll have a much better insight. But right now, in the middle of the process of it, it's kind of up in the air. You guys, your tasks for your exam, if you haven't looked at it, is you're going to ask yourselves, which is more influential, domestic policies or foreign policies? And we've talked about both of these here. We talked about the Civil Rights Movement, we talked about the Great Society, we also talked about the end of the Cold War. Just because we end on the Cold War doesn't mean that foreign policy is automatically the superior choice. Just like when we were talking in the last unit between Great Depression and World War II, we ended on World War II, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the right choice. Either one of these options can be an acceptable argument. There's no wrong answer here. You're going to have to make an argument using your evidence to find out what is the best answer that you can defend with your logic and with your evidence. And it could be either one. There's no problem. So we'll talk about this on Wednesday. That's our last class. I'll give you a study guide. This is our last lecture. So this is what you're going to do.